Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk, which might be a little bit controversial. It's about why we think Angular elements make the best React components. My name is Ryan Chenkie. I'm a JavaScript developer, consultant. I do a lot of app development for businesses, do a little bit of architecture and that sort of stuff. And this is my pal, Brad. Brad, tell me about yourself.
Hi, I'm Brad. I am a software engineering lead at a company called Sapphire Digital. I am also a JavaScript developer, but I usually spend almost all day long in Angular.
So I think if we were to take a look around at the ecosystem, the JavaScript ecosystem, what we might see is that things are starting to settle a little bit on what I'll call the big three, the red, green, and blue of JavaScript. And of course, that's Angular, Vue, and React. Now, of course, these aren't the only frameworks out there. There's still plenty of relevant and popular frameworks. But if we really take a close look, I think things are starting to settle a little bit on these. And one of the problems is, I think, when we think of the way that companies and developers use these frameworks, we think of it like this. We think that one company might choose Angular, and that's all they use for all of the software they create. They make a bet on Angular, and they stick with it. And then another company might choose React, and maybe that's all that they're going to use, ever. That's the only thing that ever makes sense. And then maybe a third company, they might choose Vue. And you know, they say, we're gonna stick to Vue because, well, we liked Angular JS way back in the past, and it's kind of similar in some ways, so let's pick that. But in reality, I think it looks a little bit different.
Yeah, in reality, slide please. We have a corporation that they've decided Angular is what they're gonna do. But then they ended up and purchased someone else. And they happen to use React. So now we've got two things in the mix. And then they purchase someone else, and then we go all the way across. What the heck? Thank you. Cheap.
Woo!
Cheap technology.
All right, let's put these down.
Let's do that. Yeah, that's good. Ta-da! And then we have a team at the same food corp, and they're like, we have strong opinions, and we want to use something else. And then they go through another acquisition, then they go through another acquisition, then they go through another acquisition, and another acquisition. And so then it just becomes a great big mess. So how do you deal with that?
Well, one of the problems is when you have this arrangement, sharing code between these applications is pretty difficult, right? So you might be able to help yourself out by creating a library where you can share some code between each of these applications. But when we think about sharing actual components, so things that have self-contained behavior and can receive inputs and put out, emit outputs, it's difficult to share these components between different applications built on different frameworks. And that's a bit of a problem. So what if, instead, what if we could have, is this one working?
It worked.
What if we could have what would be sort of a custom element, right? Something that looks just like a native HTML element, and something that we could give a custom name to and drop in anywhere. What if that custom element could have sort of a private DOM around it, so that scripting and styling doesn't bleed out to the overall application? And then what if we could share these components between any application, regardless of the framework, regardless of what it's built on? Could even be a static HTML page. And thankfully, there is a standard which you may have heard of called Web Components, which helps us to do just that. With Web Components, what we can do is have something of a custom element. We use the Custom Elements API. And what that looks like is we can give the element a name, anything we want, where it looks like a native HTML element. And because the Custom Elements API extends from the browser's HTML element, it has some predictable behavior. So it's not some kind of bespoke, really custom-made thing that's going to be dicey whether or not it works in certain browsers. It has predictable behavior. So doing this, you know, we've got the situation where things aren't super well supported everywhere. You know, we've got pretty good support in evergreen browsers, but the usual suspects, they're a bit behind. But support, you know, is getting better. And what we're seeing is that polyfills can really help us out to fill the gaps. So, sounds pretty good, right? What are people saying about web components? Well, it turns out not everybody is all that convinced that they're the best thing in the world. Some people figure maybe they're not ready, maybe it's not a great idea to go for these things. And I think there's good reason for that. because in reality, nothing is ever going to beat a component in its native habitat. If you want to create a React component, the best place to do that is in React and consume it in React. Same goes for Angular, any other framework. Nothing beats a component in its native habitat. But if you do have a legitimate need to share components between different technologies, then I think web components make a compelling case for this. And furthermore, we'd like to contend, oh, geez.
Maybe it's not working.
We'd like to contend that Angular elements are going to give you the best experience to do that. So if you do want to create web components, there's nothing that can really beat an Angular element. And there's a few reasons for this. One of the first reasons is that we're going to get the best kind of documentation and support. Developer experience is really good with Angular elements. We get the Angular APIs we all know and love, the tooling we know through the CLI. We get great documentation and content, and best overall support, largely via the Angular community. OK, so that's enough about that. Let's take a look at how it works.
Without a clicker. All right. Imagine an ideal world with us where NASA loves Angular. Woo! So NASA works on a lot of projects, and one of these projects is the International Space Station, or the ISS. And on the ISS, there is a lot of critical equipment, but one of those pieces of equipment is this thing, the discombobulator. And they want to monitor the temperature of this discombobulator, because if it gets too high, bad things can happen, and you do not want bad things happening in space. Let's look. Oh, setup first. So what they did is they have an Angular app, since they love Angular, and it is their dashboard for their ground control. And they have this temperature gauge in their Angular dashboard. It's just an Angular component, and it monitors the temperature of the discombobulator. So let's look at it.
All right, let's take a look at a demo.
Where'd it go?
Right there.
All right. Oh, Ryan, could you please start the temperature update to Nator?
Starting.
Thanks. So as you can see, we're getting an input pretty much from Firebase. Yay, Firebase. Woo!
There we go.
Firebase is working. All right. And it's changing the temperature, variable temperature, and it's picking it up through an input. And just showing us the temperature. And Ryan's going to fire the high temp alert. And what happens is this is an output on the component. It then emits an event through the output to the Angular app, which then displays that warning, high temperature reported for the discombobulator. All right, and that's how it works. All right, slides.
Back to the slides we go.
Woohoo! All right, now this is the American Space Station, right? Or the ASS for short? No, it is the International Space Station, the ISS. And since it is the International Space Station, there are lots of other space agencies and lots of other countries that also have a vested interest and want to monitor the temperature of the discombobulator. But they want to know, why do we really have to write something else? You've already got it working, NASA. Can you just give it to us? And the problem is, these other agencies don't use Angular. They use maybe React or Vue or a GeoCity site, for all we know. So NASA put their big NASA heads together, and they came up with what they think is the best solution, which is a web component built with Angular elements. So let's see how that happens. So we're going to take our Angular component, our temperature gauge, and we're going to turn it into an Angular element, which is a lot like this. Just let's leave this here for a minute. This is good. This is so enjoyable. Ta-da! All right, but we're not going to do it in live coding because #NotKara. Thank you for remembering that. So the first step is to add Angular elements, and we simply do that with ng-add @Angular/elements. And that's there. The next thing we do is, since we have an Angular component turning it into an element, it's not really the same as an Angular app anymore. So we have to actually manually bootstrap this Angular component in the app module using ng-bootstrap. We do first create a custom element, bing, where we pass our temperature gauge component in and the injector, so we still have dependency injection. And then we use the custom elements API of the browser that we were mentioning earlier to define the element so that it knows what it's doing. And since it's all dynamic, we need to add it to the entry components so Angular knows that it needs to look for this when it comes up. Now, I was talking to Rob Wormold, and a lot of this stuff is going to get a lot simpler in the future. It's not here yet, but it's supposed to get simpler. Next. All right. So, since we don't care about the whole dashboard anymore, we just care about that one component. And right now, before it gets simpler, as Rob was saying, we need to replace the app root with our temperature gauge component. So we just do that. We get rid of app root. We throw the temperature gauge component in there, and we add the relevant inputs, and in our case, NASA, it's Fahrenheit, and the station component of discombobulator. All right, and then we do ng-serve, because we want to see how it works, right? So we do ng-serve, and then we get an error. Failed to construct HTML element, please use the new operator. What this means is polyfills. We need polyfills, because not every browser, as we saw, has support or even partial support for it. We do this by installing this great Web Components custom elements polyfill, npm install, and then we add 2 polyfills to our polyfills TS file, and then they're good, and then it'll work. Let's take a look at it.
All right, so heading over to the demo.
All right, is our temperature updating? It is updating, and this is the same component, but it has been Angular elementized. We're running in an Angular app, and we have our high temp alert, but if you'll notice, even though the event was emitted through the output, we didn't handle it, so nothing really happened other than in that little component. So now that we have this component ready to go, we still need to distribute it. And that's kind of something that's not often talked about. We get like, hey, make it an Angular element, or make something here, and then, hey, use it over here. But we never connect the pieces on how to get there. So that's what this is for. So distribution, we think the best way is using ngx build plus and npm. And we'll go through this real quick, because it's out there, but first we just need to add ngx build plus, which simply updates the builder. Next. And then that gives us 2 flags, like Manfred was talking about in his talk. We have the save, or single bundle, and keep polyfills. Next. And those 2 flags we're going to add to our prod script. Next. And then we'll run this build script, and then we get, next, keep going. And then we get a dist folder with 3 files. Well, more files, but 3 that we care about. Main.js, which is basically our component file, all the code for our component. Polyfills.js, which is all the polyfills taken in the imports and everything, put in, concatenated into polyfills.js. And scripts.js, which is the core Angular stuff. And those are the 3 that we care about. But we have our built thing, but we still need to package it and get it out there. So we need a package.json file that we're going to drop in our dist folder. But if you leave it in your dist folder, the next time you build, it's going to get overwritten. So I like to put it in the assets folder. Just give it a name and a version number. As simple as that. You could add more stuff. But then you just copy that to the dist folder. And then once that's in the dist folder, next, we just run npm pack. And then we end up with, next, we end up with a tgz file, which is our packaged element, packaged web component, ready to publish. Next. Woo! All right, so now let's launch this thing up in React and see how that's going to work.
So if you've detected a little bit of a funny accent from me with words like JavaScript so far, that's because I come from a little country to the north called Canada. And you know, as a proud Canadian, my favorite space agency is the Canadian Space Agency. And if you've never heard of it, I'm not surprised. But the Canadian Space Agency has given us all sorts of really cool stuff. It's given us astronauts like Chris Hadfield, who maybe you've seen on Twitter, and he's shared a lot of his journey in space. The CSA has given us things like the robotic arm that sits on the International Space Station and moves cargo ships in to bring in fresh cargo. And you know, we're here at this conference in the States, which is largely international, I know, but probably mostly Americans here, right? And I understand some of the stereotypes that Americans have for Canadians. Things like how we're always so polite, we're always saying sorry, and we're always, you know, super cordial. But you know, that's not always how it is. In fact, you could say that Canadians are kind of like to Americans, like React developers are to Angular developers. We're always judging you. Oh, no. There's no way that the slide skipped on the punchline. Did it?
It did.
Oh, God. Ta-da. Anyway. No. I'm going back here. All right, so speaking of the Canadian Space Agency and React, in our ideal world, the Canadian Space Agency wants to use React for their mission control. And they don't want to have to go rebuild the same components that NASA already built to tell the temperature. They want to just reuse that component. And thankfully, because we have this as an Angular element, we can make use of it in React. So starting out is pretty easy. We just do npm install the package name. I believe it's ISS temperature gauge that we're going to do. And then we just drop it in, ISS temperature gauge, right into the application. We can pass it some inputs, and it's going to work out of the box.
Notice
now,
he passed Celsius since it's Canada instead of Fahrenheit.
Absolutely.
So that's relevant in the future.
We have different units up north. And so what we're going to get here is we can pass these inputs. There's something to note here, though, is when you go to pass inputs to this element in React, it's going to act a little bit differently. You can't pass an object in, kind of like you would if you were binding in an Angular application. It's just going to serialize whatever you pass into a string. So there's some extra work to do if you want to operate on an object. But anyway, what we're going to get next is the need to listen for events coming from the component. And so it might be tempting to do something like this, where we have an event binding. The high temperature event, when that is triggered, maybe run some method to operate on it. We can't really do this in React, though. This is just an Angular thing. There's some special work that we've got to do in React instead. And what we've got to do in particular is we've got to set up this ref, this reference on the element. And this is a React thing where you can reference a DOM node, and then you can operate on it however you like. And so what we'll do is we'll set up in, say if we had a stateful component, we'll set up this local member ISS temp component, and then we'll have this method to handle the reference to that node. And all it's going to do is point this local member to that node, essentially. So then what we can do is pass in the handle ref method to ref. All right, so how do we actually get information out of the element? Well, in the component did mount lifecycle hook, for example, we can add an event listener. So our element is going to emit something called high temp, and we can take the event, do whatever we want with it in React. We can set some state, whatever we want, really. And then we'd want to clean up when the component is unmounted. We'd want to remove the event listener to prevent memory leaks and that sort of thing. So we can listen for the event. And a crucial point here is it's not just the fact there's an event being emitted that we can tap into. It's information. It's detail from the event emitted by Angular. We can get the alert status. We can get the name, temperature, and set that outside of the element itself. All right, so let's do the React demo now. There we go. So CSA mission control. We've got our units in Celsius. This is the same Angular element that we've been seeing before. And Brad's going to trigger high temp now. And we've got our high temperature warning. So crucial point to note here is that everything right here that you see is Angular. But it's the information being emitted from it is being used to do other things in the consuming application. So we can drop it right in, and then we can act on information coming out of it. All right. So because this is a web component, of course, we are not limited to just Angular and React. We can use it anywhere. So if Russia uses Vue for their mission control, they could share the same component. Now, this looks, pretty enticing, but is this a good idea? Brad, what do you think?
Yes and no. I think it is a good idea in certain instances. But let's look at why it might not be a good idea. Bundle size. If bundle size is an issue, then it's just not there yet. And Ivy will help this, but I'm not sure exactly how much. No, Manfred showed us some, but it's not all the way there yet. And this is why, because Ivy isn't here. And a big deal is if you need to do content projection or anything that requires anything you have to do at runtime, it might not be good for you. But reasons why it might be a good idea is if you're upgrading from AngularJS to Angular, then you can build your components in Angular, turn them into web components, drop them back into AngularJS, and do a piecemeal upgrade, and it'll work great. Sam knows a lot about how to upgrade, whether that's the path or not. We all have, well, I'm assuming we all have framework experience and familiarity, so that's a good reason. And Ivy is coming, and that is also a good reason. And I was talking to Rob, and there's a lot of things happening down the path, on the roadmap, where it's going to make this actually a really good idea. So while it's still kind of early, it's still a really good idea.
All right, that's just about all we have. We'd like to give very special thanks to two people, Yuri and Manfred, who have some great content out there. Yuri's got a great course on egghead.io. Let's give him a clap, yeah. Yuri's got a great course on aked.io. I'd encourage you to check that out. And Manfred's got some content online, some written content that is very good and in-depth as well. So check those out. And then the links for all that we've done here, including the repos, if you want to check those out, everything is at this bit.ly link, ng-conf-elements. And that's just about all we have for you. Next one, we are here on Twitter at Ryan Chenkie.
At Sonic Park.
And we'd like to encourage everyone not to buy $30 slide advancers if you can help it, please.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your time. We'll be around if you want to talk, and have a great rest of your conference.
Thanks.